Welcome to episode 4 of Definitely Not Another Podcast. The podcast review show by me, Neal, where I try to divine the difference between the good podcasts and the bad podcasts so that we can all up our game. Despite the title, you can in fact subscribe to Definitely Not Another Podcast on iTunes, Spotify and YouTube, where you will see that the hairdressers have been reopened in Singapore, hence the new do. Now, those of you watching this on YouTube may think that I have accidentally forgotten to illustrate the seemingly blank white PowerPoint slide behind me. But no. This is a picture of the Arctic, or maybe the Antarctic. Either way, it's where today's podcast is going to take us. If you are feeling the cabin fever, if you long for exotic locales, if you want to escape the stinking heat and humidity of Singapore, this may be the podcast for you. Brand new from Far Features, this is Two Poles.
You're listening to The Two Poles, a new podcast produced by farfeatures.com. The world has changed. Everywhere you look, people are stuck inside. We can't go outside, and we can't see our friends. But we can still talk. Come travel to the Arctic and Antarctica. This is The Two Poles, a new podcast exploring our present and future with the Arctic and Antarctica. Each week I'll be speaking to scientists, explorers, adventurers, writers, filmmakers, musicians, and regular people who live and work in the polar regions. They'll bring you unique access and insights into some of the most remote and fastest warming places on the planet.
Okay, a confession up front. This podcast is made by an outstanding journalist called Fraser Morton, who also happens to be a friend of mine. Had the podcast been rubbish, to be honest, I wouldn't have reviewed it. I love this show, but I'm not going to risk a friendship over it. As it happens, the podcast is great, though not without some room for improvement. Hence, I thought I would give it the once over. So the first thing that grabs you about this podcast is the sound design. I've not really said much about sound design so far in this series because generally it's deployed in narrative podcasts to create the sense of a scene that locates the action. It's not often used in interview-based podcasts, but Fraser uses it here to instantly transport us from our beds, armchairs and cars to a completely different world. An upbeat electronic opening track gives way to moody strings that morph into the once familiar sounds of life before lockdown that drift out of the reverb like long-lost memories, then get swallowed by the howling polar wind that carries the sound of chattering penguins, grunting polar bears and cracking ice. Sound design like this can have a palpable effect on your mood. I'd originally been intending to multitask whilst listening to this, but the overture signaled to me that I really needed to sit down, pay attention and immerse myself in the stories to follow. The story that does follow in episode 1 is told in the form of a conversation between Fraser and Matthew Phillips, the winter manager at the British Antarctic Survey, who is waiting in the Falkland Islands to take the last boat south. Now, in my last episode, I complained about the types of podcasts that see two mates sitting down for a vague, meandering chat about life, the universe, and everything. And that's sort of what happens here over 75 minutes. It's a little exhausting. Don't get me wrong, it's a fascinating conversation because it's about an extraordinary person doing an extraordinary thing in an extraordinary place. But it could have been split into two parts. Part 1, the first half, is really about Matthew's preparation for living up to 9 months, many in complete darkness, in the Antarctic. how he had to say goodbye to his friends and family without touching them and be kept in quarantine for 14 days in the Falklands before catching the last boat south, where he would once again languish in quarantine for another 14 days with presumably nothing to think about but whether or not his friends and family will survive the pandemic that he's leaving behind, and which hasn't yet found its way to the Antarctic. Part 2 is about what he does when he's down there, the work of the British Antarctic Survey, and essential tips for staying sane when you can't go out because it's minus 20 degrees outside and pitch black, which is pretty relevant to everyone right now. Matthew is a good-humoured and charming Scot, much like Fraser. He's brave and kind and the sort of bloke that, frankly, I could stand to be a bit more like. Unfortunately for Matthew, all does not go to plan, which is what the second episode is all about. I won't give away exactly what happens, but there is an unexpected twist to Matthew's story, although I'm not entirely sure it justifies a whole episode to itself. Episode 3 is where we start to get back on track with another fascinating guest, the fearless polar explorer and activist Sir Robert Swan, who tells Fraser exclusively the story of his most recent expedition to the South Pole, the culmination of a 33-year odyssey to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. Again, Sir Robert is the kind of brave, upstanding, stiff upper-lipped Brit of the old school. At 61 years old, his latest trek could have been his last to anywhere. It wasn't, but it came very close twice. After decades trekking the most hostile environments on Earth, Sir Robert was in need of a new hip, which he got before departing for the far south. Having been through physiotherapy and intense training, he assumed he was ready, until he tried to have a poo on the ice. It seems that when you need to go in Antarctica, you need to be quick about it before frostbite sets in, which is not easy when you have a trick hip, let me tell you. If you want all the gruesome details, and they are gruesome, then you've got to hear them from Sir Robert. It'll make your eyes water. All joking aside though, Sir Robert's achievements are hard-won. He sees Antarctica as a living being, describes it as a latent force that will be unleashed on the world if we fail to protect it. He says repeatedly that on his previous visits to the continent, it let him through, as though it kind of made the conscious decision to allow him to pass. He says Antarctica looks for your weaknesses and tries to exploit them. At times it's less like he's describing a place and more like a person, the other half of an obsessive and unhealthy relationship that he returns to time and time again, despite the obvious damage it does to him. One thing I can't help but notice is that Sir Robert repeats himself a lot, not in an absent-minded way, but in an obsessive way that demonstrates his single-minded determination to complete whatever task he sets himself, even if it takes him more than 30 years to do it. Ultimately, the reason to tell these stories is not purely escapism and adventure, but to bring people closer to these two continents that are essential to our survival as a species. Right now, it seems to me we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to effect real and lasting change for the better. All the things that we thought impossible have suddenly become possible since the pandemic. Concepts that seemed radical just a few months ago, like universal basic income or the Green New Deal, have suddenly become mainstream because our relationship to the Earth and each other has been thrown into sharp focus. Let this podcast take you on an adventure to the ends of the Earth and inspire you to do your part to protect it. Fraser and his partner Esther specialise in telling stories about exotic places and the people they find there. If that interests you, then I'd really recommend checking out their website at farfeatures.com and searching out their documentary Asia Antarctica on Vimeo. You can also support them on Patreon at patreon.com/farfeatures. They have some really great new documentary projects in the works and could use your help to bring them to fruition. And that's that. Thanks so much for listening and or watching. Don't forget to subscribe on your preferred platform, and I'll be back with another episode very shortly. If you have a podcast you'd like to recommend for me to review, and bear in mind I'm not always nice about it, you can email me on neal@mooreslaw.com, which is neal@moreslore.com. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.